6 years ago, when I started working at the Bank of Winfield, I was really astonished by how many people did not know the process of what happens when you write a check. The public at large has no clue what happens after you put the pen to the piece of paper and send that check through the system. Today, we're going to talk about what happens after you do that. To be negotiable, a check has to have certain parts. And as long as those parts are there, then any piece of paper is available to be used as a check. Of course, you've got to have a check number. You've got to have a date that payment is negotiable. If you do not have a date on there, then it is negotiable at any time. But 6 months from the date that check is originally written, that check is no longer good. You have got to have who the check is made payable to. If you do not have a set person that check is written out to, it can be cashed by anyone. And that's where it can get sticky if you don't make sure that you have it set to an individual or an entity. You have to have the amount that you want the check made payable for. You can write this in two ways. You can write it numerically, or you can write it out on the legal line. If you write it both ways, the financial institution is legally required to pay it how it is written out. In other words, let's say if you write $500 as 500.00, that's all well and good. But if you write 50 in words, that's how the financial institution is going to have to pay it. So it doesn't make any difference if you deposit the check for $500. If it's got 50 on the legal line, we've got to pay that check for $50. We can't pay it for $500. You can put a memo. You don't have to. You can or not. That's up to you. Signature, really important. If we don't have a signature on the check, then it's not a negotiable item. That means that if you don't sign the check once it's been written, then we have no way to prove that that's something that you legally authorized or not. And if someone who's not on your account signs the check, then that's not a legally negotiable instrument either. The numbers down at the bottom of the check are called the MICR line. There's 3 parts to the MICR line. MICR is a type of magnetic ink that financial institutions have encoders that read this magnetic ink. And when that ink is read by those things, we don't have to look at the account numbers anymore. That's something that the computers can do for us. This magnetic ink reads, and it'll tell which financial institution that check has to go to for payment. It'll tell what account number that check has to go through to get the money from. And it'll tell the check number so that the computers can put it directly to that person's account, and it can go imaged to their statement every month. If a piece of paper has all of these items, then it is a legally negotiated item and can be used as a check to pay. Once you write a check, it has to go through several steps before it can be paid. First step is you write it to the person or an entity or whoever you write it to. Then that person or that entity, that business, has to either cash the check or deposit the check. Once they do that, it goes through either a teller or a cashier, and then it goes to the bank. Whether it's your bank or a bank 10,000 miles away, it all is processed the same way. So once it gets to the bank teller, the teller enters it into the system and creates a transaction. She has to have a debit and a credit. So your check is going to be the debit. So her credit is going to be whatever her teller cash item is. And once we get those 2 items, they have to have the same amount in balance. Once that's done, all of the work that teller makes during the day is sent to the back office. Once it's in the back office, the back office personnel run it through computerized encoding systems. That's the computer that reads the MICR line ink on the bottom of the check. The checks are run through, and the computer reads your handwriting. It reads the ink on the bottom of the check, and it creates an electronic image of the check and all that's in the deposit with the check. And each of these transactions are put up in an electronic spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet balances the work. In other words, if you have a check that, say, in the numerical box, the amount was written for $501, but on the legal line it was written for $500 even, and the teller just looked at the box instead of looking at the legal line, and she made her ticket, her cash ticket, for $501, that transaction is going to be out of balance because the computerized encoder is going to look at the legal line. It's going to read what was written out. And so we have to manually go in and change those numbers to make sure that they match. Once this is done, the computer is going to take all of these checks and look at where on the Micker line you have the routing number. And this routing number is going to tell the computers which bank that check's going to have to go back to. Once it figures that out, it creates what we call cash letters. And each of these cash letters are computerized copies of these checks. And they put them in a spreadsheet and they make a whole bunch of debits and then they put a credit with it. And they send that cash letter out electronically to the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve then takes and transmits all those different cash letters to the different banks that they go to. That's the reason that those routing numbers on the Micker lines are so important, because it tells the Fed where your check needs to go. Then we receive cash letters and everything from different banks all during the day. Once we receive those cash letters with those checks in it, we process the check and send it to your particular account for payment. If the funds are there, we pay the check. If the funds are not there, we return it back to the bank that it was first deposited at in the same way that we received it. After the check has been imaged and sent out in a cash letter, the check itself, the hard copy that we received in deposit, is going to be destroyed. And all that's going to be left of that check forevermore is going to be a computerized image, like you get on your statement every month, or you see on your internet banking. So once you deposit that paper check and it runs through the system and goes through this, it is no more. You may think that checks are becoming a thing of the past, and sometimes they are in our electronic age. They kind of are. But, eventually you're going to have to write at least one in your time in business. The government does monitor how checks are paid and how they're cashed. In 1987, the Expedited Funds Availability Act was put into place, and it's in the Uniform Commercial Code called Regulation CC. And that regulates how financial institutions are required to pay checks. In other words, we are required to pay checks within so many days from the time they are deposited. In other words, if you have someone who writes you a check who lives in California and you live in New York City, it's going to take that check longer to get back to the bank for payment than if somebody in Brooklyn wrote you a check if you lived in New York City, because it has to go through so many different places to get back to you. So it takes longer. Well, a lot of banks sometimes will try to place holds on the funds before they give you the money. Well, the government tells us how long we can do that before we are required to make those funds available to you. And now, local and non-local checks, which are checks that are written within your district or checks that are written out of your district, we can only place up to a 2-day hold on them. The Federal Reserve has 16 districts of banks. The whole entire country is made up of those 16 districts. And if you are a federally traded bank, you have to be involved in one of those districts. Are there any questions? Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen.